And with that, I'd also like to tell folks that our next confab, which will be the last one of the year, is scheduled for December 2nd, and it's Archaeology for a Changing Colorado, the Economic Benefits of Archaeology in Colorado, with my boss and the state archaeologist, Dr. Holly Norton. This will be a really important confab for our repositories, I think, to attend. As many of you, I'm sure, know that archaeology and history and historic places play an important role in the economy of Colorado. And Dr. Norton's going to highlight this recent study, which I highlighted a little bit in the last curation notes. But I think you'll find this very informative, and we'll have some time also at the end for questions, suggestions, that kind of thing. So please try to join us for our next confab, which will be the last one of the year, on December 2nd. Look for the curation notes for more information and how to register for that. So before we go into Marilyn's presentation, I thought it would be really appropriate to show a video which highlights Marilyn's work because she was the recipient of this year's Stephen Hart Award for her lithophone work and for the collections that come from the Great Sand Dunes National Park. And hopefully this will come out really well, and you'll be able to kind of get a better context before Marilyn actually starts her presentation. So I'm going to mute myself and start the video. And
looking at artifacts as a musical instrument is a whole new way of evaluating something. You can experience them through the music.
The thing that just intrigues me and enchants me is when you listen to the note, you're hearing a note that could be 10,000 years old.
Litho is Greek for stone, and phone means sound. So a lithophone is a musical instrument that consists of a purposely selected rock. People found rocks that had musical properties, and then they shaped them to look like this. And what they were doing really was creating certain sounds. So the sound is based on the length and the width of the artifact.
Not that long ago, there were these lithophones that were found in archaeological sites here at the Great Sand Dunes, and we did not know what they were.
We studied them for a long time, and we thought they were used for grinding and crushing, but the use where, when you look at them under a microscope, it didn't make sense. A colleague, David Killam, sent me a YouTube video. French soldiers had brought these artifacts back to Paris in the early 1900s, and they didn't really know, again, what they were until the researcher, who was a jeweler, happened to tap on them. And that's when he realized they were lithophones. I was actually by myself at the house, and it was nighttime, and I tapped on them, and it made the hair on my arm stand up. I mean, it was amazing. And I just kept tapping them, and I just couldn't get over it because we had never thought about tapping artifacts.
I remember when you tapped them for the first time that I had chills.
It started with History Colorado, the State Historical Fund, because they did fund a grant to study these. And of course, Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve was very supportive of this research. And then the Friends of the Dunes agreed to take on the grant.
One of the 2-foot-long lithophones that was discovered, a local fellow was on horseback and he saw a little piece of it sticking up, and he got off his horse and he kicked it, and he said he dang near broke his foot. But then when we realized and appreciate that this stone was buried vertically, so in a sea of sifting sand, that would allow it to be found again. If you just laid it flat, it would be long buried. And so you would have these sites that you would go to, most likely where water occurs, and revisit them. And that's where you would cache things that were heavy, because you wouldn't carry a lithophone with you as you're chasing buffalo across the landscape. Current thinking about the age of the lithophones is that they're Paleo-Indian. And so these are the end of the last ice age.
They tell the story of what people did besides living to survive. You know, everybody needs food, water, and shelter. Those are the basics. But even people thousands of years ago wanted more than that. Just like us, they wanted things that make life meaningful. And one of those things is music.
Okay, sorry about starting it a couple times there. Marilyn, you are about ready to go on?
You bet. Thank you very much. And thanks for your patience. We're always having a few little challenges with the sound through Zoom, but so I guess you got to hear the definition several times, so I'll try not to repeat it too many times for you. But thank you very much for joining me, and I appreciate COD having me on. And I hope if you have any questions at the end, you'll feel free to ask them. So what I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit more about what lithophones are, why they're important, and then how you can actually identify one that might be in your museum collections. So many years ago, we identified a number of unique and interesting shaped groundstone artifacts in the museum collections at Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, and from other areas in the San Luis Valley. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this area, but if not, this map shows you where the San Luis Valley is located and its relationship to Great Sand Dunes. Next. The artifacts that we were examining are very long, carefully shaped through pecking and grinding, and are made from stone. For example, the one shown on the right there is over 2 feet long and weighs close to 10 pounds. Some have been referred to in writing or labeled in museum collections or displays as pestles, roller manos, kneading stones, digging tools, hideworking tools, or various types of axes, and actually a lot of other names that I'll talk about later. Next. Originally, we thought most of these artifacts from Great Sand Dunes must be some sort of grinding tool like a pestle that was used to crush and grind in an up and down or circular motion like the one you see on the left there, or possibly some type of long mano that was used with a metate as shown on the right. But after preliminary analysis, we realized the artifacts didn't have wear patterns on them if used primarily to crush and grind. And many were also so large and heavy and carefully shaped, it didn't seem to make sense that they were created only for a simple utilitarian purpose. So the function remained a mystery, and we put them back in the museum drawers for a number of years. Next. Then a few years ago, like I mentioned in the video, a colleague sent me a YouTube video of this French researcher that you can see on the left here, Eric Gontier, and he had drawers of these in the Museum of Man in Paris, and they had been collected by French soldiers and brought back to France in the early 1900s, but nobody really knew what they were until Mr. Gontier, who was a jeweler, happened to tap on them, and that's when he realized they were actually lithophones. And so you've already heard this definition a couple times, but lithophones can be either a purposely shaped, or sometimes they're unshaped rocks, but they are either tapped or they can be rubbed with friction to make musical sounds. So after I saw this video of Mr. Gontier, I was really pretty skeptical because no one in Colorado had ever mentioned sound as a function for groundstone artifacts. But I thought, well, I should at least try to tap on these. So one of my daughters is actually a percussionist, and she had a basket full of mallets. So I grabbed one of those and I tapped on a couple of these artifacts from Great Sand Dunes, and I just couldn't get over it because they made beautiful musical sounds. And I just thought, well, maybe I'm the first person that's heard these in 1,000 years. Next. So after doing a lot of research, I realized that lithophones are really not some new unknown type of artifact. They're actually well known, and they're found throughout the world, including Europe, the Far East, Africa, the South Sea, South America, China, and Vietnam, to just name a few places. And some have been dated 5,000 to 6,000 years old, or some are even older than that. So the research revealed to me that there are basically two types of lithophones. One is stationary, and the other are portable lithophones. You can see examples of stationary lithophones here, including on the upper left there, stalactite lithophones from caves in Africa, which show evidence of use wear from being played, like this guy is doing in the photo. Also, large boulders found in various parts of the world, like the one shown here from Africa and Scotland, were also played as lithophones. So these are stationary lithophones. And apparently the different little cup areas that you see there play different notes. Next. In the upper photo here, there's an example of a large stationary but positioned lithophone in Azerbaijan. And a gal sent me this, and she said she heard this being played. And in the lower two photos there, you can see there are two places in the US that exhibit stationary boulders that have acoustical properties. One is in Pennsylvania, it's called Ringing Rocks Park. And the other is in Montana, it's called the Ringing Rocks, and it's actually on BLM land. And you can go to these two locations with your rock hammer and actually play the boulders. And if you want to hear these boulders being played without actually going there, you can just Google search for ringing rocks in the US. Next. As you can see in these photos, portable lithophones are found around the world as well. Some are unmodified or minimally modified rocks, and some are highly modified. Portable lithophones were played in different ways. They could be suspended vertically. You can see examples of lithophones in Ecuador in the upper left photo there. And others were suspended horizontally, like the examples from Ethiopia that you can see in the center in the upper right. And there are also highly modified ones made from jade that are played and hung in China and South Korea, shown in those bottom two photos. Next. Other portable suspended lithophones include bell stones from Kauai and other Hawaiian islands. There's an example of one shown on the left there. And kiva bells, which are a type of lithophone made from unmodified or minimally modified stones, shown on the right there, and then also on the center bottom. These are from pueblos in the southwestern US, and were also reportedly often suspended and played vertically. Next. Other portable lithophones were, or actually still are, played horizontally like a xylophone, like the ones still played in Vietnam that you can see in the upper left photo there. Or they could be played on the ground like the stones in Togo, shown on the two right-hand photos. Or others may have been played upright like the ancient lithophones found in Vietnam, shown in the lower photos on the left there. Next. Some other types of portable lithophones include very large stone lithophones from Belize in Central America, shown in the photo on the left, which were shaped by flaking rather than grinding and pecking. In other words, these are like huge bifaces. And on the right is another group of large flake stone bifaces found in a cache in Labrador that have been interpreted as lithophones. Next. Other very large slab lithophones from Cambodia are shown in the photo on the left. And I'd sure like to hear these being played. It would be amazing to hear what they sound like. There was an article written in 2013 in the peer-reviewed journal American Antiquity, which I'm sure you've all heard about. And maybe you saw this article. The author, Duncan Caldwell, described several portable rounded lithophones found in New England. And you can see photos of those two lithophones on the right there. He noted that lithophones could be a new class of artifacts in most of North America. And as far as I know, no lithophones have ever been identified in Colorado until now. Next. So in 2016, with the support of the National Park Service, History Colorado, State Historical Fund, and the Friends of the Dunes, I wrote a grant to study the potential lithophones from Great Sand Dunes and the San Luis Valley. And I chose a sample of 22 potential lithophones that you can see here in this photo. They really varied in size from about 9 inches in length to just over 2 feet. So the ones on the very left are the 2-footers. There's much less variation in width. They range from about 2 to 3 inches wide. And the overall body shape really varied from almost perfectly rounded or cylindrical to a flattened oval shape in cross section. And you can see some of those different shapes just by looking at the photo there. The ends are highly varied in shape and are beveled, rounded, slightly flattened, cone-shaped, or pointed, and often vary from one end to the other on a single artifact. The weight of these varied from 2 pounds to 10 pounds. So of course the shorter ones were the lighter ones and the heavier ones were the longest ones. The material types, which is actually really important, and I'll talk about that in a minute, appear to primarily be volcanic and metamorphic rocks such as granites, basalts, andesites, and schists. Next. For our grant, each one of the artifacts were described in detail and extensively photographed to help us try to understand how they were made, why they may have been shaped certain ways, and how they may have been played. For example, I took top and side view photos of each lithophone. You can see those top 2 photos there of this particular lithophone. It's interesting because in side view, this lithophone is undulating in shape. We don't know if that was from the original rock form or if it was made to be undulating on purpose to affect the sound qualities. This particular one is 2 feet long and it weighs about 6 pounds. And if you see the little white areas there, those are where they are pecked. And there's also calcium carbonate in the little peck mark, so it pops them out so you can see them. But it shows that they were carefully shaped by pecking. One of the ends of this particular lithophone comes to a slight point, which is typical of many of the artifacts that we studied. And for you musician types, this lithophone plays an A sharp and a D when tapped. And when you rub on it, it's also very resonant. Next. This is another example of a lithophone that we studied. This one's over 2 feet long and it weighs 9 pounds. It's almost round in cross section. You can see in the middle bottom photo there. But in side view, it's slightly curved and tapered toward one end. Lithophone researchers have suggested that the longer rounded lithophones like this one may have been intentionally curved to help stabilize them if played across the lap or legs. In other words, while you're playing, you don't want the thing to roll off. This lithophone has also been finely pecked, and it plays 2 distinct notes when tapped, an F sharp and a D sharp. And it's also very resonant when you rub on it. Next. A few of the lithophones have straight body forms, but most are either curved or undulating. like that first one we looked at. From a side view, if you look at them, they may look flat if you lie them down, but if you look at them in a side view, oftentimes they're sort of curved. And you can see examples on those top 3 photos of curved and undulating lithophones, and then a basically straight form on the bottom there. Next. The photo on the left is a close-up that shows examples of the many hundreds and hundreds of peck marks on the bodies of most of these lithophones, suggesting they were carefully and deliberately shaped. The artifact shown on the right has what appears to be a residue, possibly red ochre on the surface near one end. Next. Variations of the surfaces of the lithophones include most that have been pecked and also ground into a real even surface. A few, like the one shown in that upper photo there, have been pecked, but the surface was left roughened, possibly to make it more resonant when played with friction. So when you rub on this particular one, it really makes a loud sound, and that's because it's so rough. The artifact in the lower right photo there exhibits an oval shape indented area on the body with numerous striations parallel to the length of the body. And we think this might be marks showing how it was played with a hard mallet, like a rock. And the lithophone in the lower left photo shows several distinct impact marks that you can see shown by that yellow arrow there, that could have been created by striking it with a hard mallet like another rock when it was being played. And when you actually play this lithophone, that's about where you would strike it. Next. Other lithophones show evidence of being highly polished like this one. It's not known if this was for aesthetic purposes only, or if it may have helped to create a more resonant or specific sound quality. Next. We've also recently found 2 lithophones that have pecked designs on the body of the lithophone. On the left, you can see, if you look carefully, 2 of the 5 sets of zigzag lines, they're pecked, that are around the body of this particular lithophone. In the southwestern US, zigzag lines often represent lightning or fertility. Of course, we don't know why these are on this particular lithophone, but I'm sure there's some significance to it. And this particular artifact is one of the lithophones that was recently discovered in the History Colorado Museum collections. So we are pretty excited to find this particular one. On the right, the lithophone exhibits 3 pecked angled lines and also 2 straight lines that extend around the whole lithophone. This artifact is in a private collection in eastern Colorado, and I was lucky enough to go with Todd to view this collection and actually got to play this lithophone. And we're hoping that someday we may get a chance to actually have the museum acquire this collection, and we can research this more. So here's our first chance to hear a short video, and I'll let Todd go ahead and play the video, we hope.
These are the 4 newly discovered from the History Colorado Museum collections.
Okay, next. The sound was a little off with those, but you can still get an idea of what the lithophones sound like when you tap on them. Sort of like a metal bell, or in some cases they sound more like a xylophone or a wooden marimba. So actually, how do they make sounds? This was something that I had to work with some people who knew about sound and the physics of sound to understand this. Sound travels through a lithophone as sound waves when they're tapped. So if you tap on the end of it, how it creates a sound is all based on the physics of sound and how it travels through various materials. The sound waves travel in two curves that cross each other twice when the lithophone is tapped. And where those sound waves cross, as shown by the yellow arrows on the left there, are called the acoustical nodes, or a simple term is dull zones. And these are the only two spots where a lithophone can be either held, suspended, or laid on a rope or other material without muffling the sound. So if you grab a lithophone in the center and try to play it, it'll muffle the sound. The only place you can actually touch it or put it on something is those two locations shown by the yellow arrow. And it's actually similar to a modern marimba. If you look on the lower right there, you can see the marimba pieces are actually attached to the frame at those same two acoustical nodes. So the acoustical nodes are located about 25% of the entire length of each piece or each artifact from the ends. And you can see that varies, of course, depending on how long it is, but it's still the same ratio, 25% from each end. Next. So one of the main grant tasks was to conduct the acoustical analysis, because we were trying to figure out how do they make these sounds, what sounds do they make, and we used some software that identifies and records the sound characteristics. And if you find lithophones in your collections, you can actually download some free software, an app, and just put it on your phone and figure out what notes that your lithophone plays. So the lithophones play at least two sounds, one on the top surface and the bottom surface, and then another note on the sides. So if you play the top, you'll get one note. If you play the side, you'll hear another note. Sometimes they play multiple notes depending on where exactly you hit them. Many of the lithophones also play what are called overtones, or a combination of notes at the same time. Sometimes these sounds are dissonant to our ears here in the western part of the world, but in some cultures around the world, these sounds are considered normal. So the sounds produced by lithophones are similar to metal bells, tapping on a metal crystal, or your wine glass, for example, a wooden marimba, or a metal xylophone. And in general, the longer lithophones play a lower note, while the shorter ones play a higher note, similar to the high and low notes produced on a modern xylophone or marimba. Also, most portable lithophones are at least 4.5 times longer than they are wide to make the best sounds. So you can see why these all tend to have a certain width, but they can be various lengths. You can also play them, as I mentioned, with friction or rubbing instead of just tapping. But here's the key: not all rocks produce musical sounds. It depends on the type of rock and the density of the material, as well as the shape, length, and thickness of the artifact. For example, rocks like sandstone do not produce musical notes because the material is not dense enough. So if you're looking in your collections and you find something that says sandstone, it will probably not make any musical sounds. So you need to look for other very dense things like granites, andesite, schist, basalt, petrified wood, type of rocks like that. And now we're going to play a couple videos, hopefully. Todd, one of them is turning and playing a lithophone so you can hear the different kinds of sounds it makes and how it can make sort of a dissonant sound when you're turning it. And another one will just be showing tapping on a lithophone and then rubbing on it so you can hear what the sound's like. And then finally playing a natural cobble and another rock, actually a mono, that have no acoustical properties, and then comparing that to lithophone that of course has acoustical properties. So go for it, Todd.
This is a natural cobble with no musical properties. This is a groundstone mono with no acoustical properties. This is a lithophone.
Okay, you get it. At least you can get a little idea. The sound's a little bit delayed on those videos, but you can still kind of hear the difference between a sandstone mono, for example. When you tap on it, it really doesn't have any, you can hear it being tapped. There's no musical quality to it. So when I was testing the artifacts that I was studying, I tried to pick natural materials for mallets that would have been available to prehistoric folks, including rock, bone, wood, and antler. You can see examples of those in the upper left photo there. All of these natural mallets, except for some very soft woods, produce good sounds, but the harder the mallet, the better the sound that was produced. What I use today, and that you can see in a lot of these photos and videos, are what are called modern composite mallets that are used to play a xylophone. And the reason I use these is they're hard enough to make a sound, but they won't make new marks on your artifact. And so that's why I use those rather than, I tested them. I tested rocks and other things, but I try not to use those on artifacts because I don't want to create new marks on there. So what I tried doing is playing the artifacts that I was studying in different positions. If you'll notice, they're always played with the acoustical nodes being supported. So you can play them across your knees, you can play them across your ankles. You can hold one of the nodes and play them in a vertical position, or you can suspend them like the upper right photo there on a string. And as long as it's being suspended or held on those two acoustical nodes, then you'll get a great sound. So the 22 artifacts that I was studying played a minimum of 57 notes. That's an average of more than 2 notes each. So that's pretty amazing, even though these are simple artifacts, that they play at least 2 notes each. If you're a musician type, over half of the notes played are what we call pentatonic, or notes that are played by the black keys on a piano. And we know that pentatonic scales in various forms are the most commonly used tonal structure found in music all over the world. And it's really fascinating to me because all of these simple, supposedly simple rock artifacts have a tonal structure that's used in music of virtually every worldwide civilization. And we have a couple more quick videos here. Todd will play one showing just using some of the different natural mallets. And then also playing that one lithophone in the upper right, shown played horizontally.
Composite mallet, bone, rock, antler,
Okay, so what's next? We know that lithophones are found all over the world and that we probably have quite a few here in North America, but how do we find them? I think one of the things that I'd like to do is try to see if we can identify lithophones in museum collections. And so that's something that's that I'm currently working on now. And hopefully some of you folks will help me out on that and find some of these in your collections. Just as an example, on the left there are 4 of a group of 12 groundstone artifacts that were found in the 1950s in Arizona by a well-known Colorado archaeologist, Dr. Joe Ben Week. A lot of you have probably heard that name before. At the time, their function was not determined. He wrote this up and talked about this cache. And at first he thought they were digging tools. And then when he really looked at them, he decided that didn't make sense. So he just left it open. He said he didn't know what they were. But this is the kind of thing that I'd like to look for in museums and test to see if they have musical properties, because I think there's a good chance that they're lithophones, because they sure look similar to some of the ones that we've been studying. Also, I think other types of brownstone artifacts could actually be lithophones. The 2 artifacts that are shown on the right there have been described as archaeologists as a celt and adze by archaeologists. In other words, tools that were thought to be used for cutting or chopping. But they also produce musical sounds like metal bells, suggesting they could have been multi-purpose tools, or maybe they function only as musical instruments, and perhaps we've misinterpreted their primary function. Especially on some of these artifacts that don't have use wear from cutting, for example, I think it'd be good to take a look at these. And I do have 2 videos showing these 2 artifacts on the right being played. And so Todd will play those next. Okay, here's just another example. The artifact in these 2 photos here is actually located in a museum in the northwestern end of the San Luis Valley, the Saguache. It's just a local museum, the Saguache Museum. This artifact was originally labeled in the museum case as a kneading stone, and the upper photo there shows what it looks like in the actual case. And when I received permission to tap on it, the sounds it produced were pretty amazing, sort of like a metal bell. And I think museums have assumed functions of artifacts just like we as archaeologists have done so. So that's another reason why I think it's worth revisiting some of these artifacts to reassess their functions. I do have a short video showing this one being played, and Todd will play that next. these are just another example of artifacts that could be lithophones. They're large, flaked, beautifully made bifaces that are often referred to as turkey tail points and are found primarily in the northeastern US, although who knows, somebody could have brought one here. So there's always a chance you could have one in your collections here in Colorado, or something like this, a large biface. A number of these turkey tails have been found in groups or caches, and sometimes they have ochre with them, for example. So people have always questioned what really were these. They have what are described as non-useful hafting notches. If you look, the yellow arrows show you where the hafting notches are located. It really doesn't make sense if you're going to have something this, put a handle on something this large, it would just probably break off. And so there was an engineer who was working with a lithophone researcher, and he suggested that those small notches make more sense for suspension rather than hafting for a handle. So in other words, suspending them would have allowed the artifacts to be run as lithophones. So I was really interested in this idea, and I gave a talk to the New England Antiquities Association, and I mentioned these artifacts as potential lithophones. And one of the members actually sent me a video of himself test playing a couple of turkey tail artifacts, and the sounds they produce were amazing. They sound like little metal bells being played. So again, I think these artifacts are just one more example of why I think it's important to reconsider the function of a number of different types of artifacts where sound hasn't really been considered. You know, archaeologists are always talking about killing things or, you know, preparing food, but there were a lot of other things going on, and I just think we need to sort of rethink that when we look at artifacts. Next. The chamahia shown on the left is an example of an artifact that's found in the southwestern US, and it's often labeled as a ceremonial hoe or an artifact with an unknown function. Many times there's no evidence of useware on these chamahias, and it's also, they're also beautifully crafted. The stone is just really nice. Oftentimes it's a siltstone that's known to have musical properties. And so these artifacts, I think people do have these. I know that there's this one in Chaco Canyon. There's some other ones that are known in different museums in the Southwest. And I think there's a good chance these could actually be lithophones. In other words, those little notches that you see there, again, those could be for hafting, but then again, they could be just for suspension if you're thinking about them as a musical instrument. And on the right are two examples of what are called jadeite axes. The jadeite was quarried from the Italian Alps, and these artifacts have been found all over Europe, including near Stonehenge, and they date back to as early as 6,000 years ago. Again, the researchers don't know what these were used for. Most of them don't have any useware that shows up. And so I'd really like to get somebody to try and tap these, because they sure look like lithophones to me. And so I think I need to go to Ireland or Europe now for a little field trip. Next. In this upper photo, in the red rectangle, there's a lithophone I like to call the mother of all lithophones. It's over 4 feet long and was reportedly found with the mammoth skull shown behind it on the table there. This artifact and the smaller one next to it are located in a local museum in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. And a Park Service person actually did tap on this longer one and said it rings. So I'm just wondering, you know, could this mean that lithophones were utilized by North America's first occupants maybe over 12,000 years ago? This is just one of the questions I think we need to be asking about these lithophones. How old are they, and how far back in time did they go here in North America? On the lower left is a photo of a very long granite lithophone that was collected in Arizona in 1910. The current owner here realized it had musical properties years ago just by handling it. He didn't really know about lithophones, but I've talked to him recently and told him about lithophones. So he's pretty excited about it. This is a huge lithophone, but I think this is just another example of why I'd like to get this information about lithophones out, not only to the general public, because many of them have collections, but also to museum staff like yourself and archaeologists, because I think there are many other lithophones out there that just simply haven't been identified yet. Next. In this upper photo, there are a number of artifacts from the Cahokia Mound area that are referred to as spuds. And this group of artifacts shown in this photo here is in a private collection, but the function of these spuds is unknown, and most show no use where, which suggests to me that they could possibly be lithophones. And I'm hoping somebody might have one of these somewhere, and maybe be willing to test it to see if they have sound qualities. Just another example of things that are in museums or in private collections that I think are worthy of testing. On the lower left there's an artifact that's labeled as a mono in the North Dakota State Museum. Again, this looks very similar to a lithophone, and so I'm hoping somebody might consider testing it. And then in the lower right photo, again, is what's called a large mono in the display case at the Fremont Indian State Park Museum. And it sure looks like a lithophone based on the lithophones that I've seen. So I'm just hoping that these examples are things that we can take forward and maybe take a second look at. Next. So in this slide, I've listed a number of types of artifacts that might possibly appear in your museum databases, at least based on my experience, that might help search for potential lithophones. Because if you try to look for the term lithophone, in most cases, based on what we found in the past, is you probably won't find anything because people didn't label artifacts like this as lithophones. But there are a number of different artifacts that could be lithophones. And so this list might help you if you're trying to find lithophones in your collections. And actually, I gave Todd a PDF of this slide. So hopefully you can access that if you're interested after this talk. Also, the other thing that History Colorado did, which was great because they didn't know how to look for these in their collections, Sheila Goff, some of you may know her, she just started pulling out drawers and looking in there to see if she could find anything that looked like a potential lithophone. She pulled them out, and then I went down there to the museum and tested them. And that's how we were able to identify 4 lithophones so far. So that's just another idea. Sometimes you actually need to just look in drawers. Next. So this slide depicts the easiest ways to test an artifact. So say you find something you think might be a lithophone, but how do you know if it is or not? You really need to go through this little process. Again, I've given Todd a PDF with more detail about how you can test them, but I'll go through it just quickly here so you can know. First, you need to identify the locations of those 2 acoustical nodes or dull zones that I was talking about. So those are located where the yellow arrows are pointed. So about 25% from each end of the artifact. You can either put it on a narrow rope at these 2 locations or suspend it horizontally using leather strips or string, or you can even hold it vertically with minimal contact at those one of those acoustical node locations. And then to test it for sound, you simply need to gently tap on the artifact on the upper surface and on the edges, if you want, in either the middle, you can see where those green arrows are, either the middle of the artifact or on either end, just not where those acoustical nodes are located. If you tap where the red X's are, you'll get a real muffled sound. So you need to tap on either end or in the middle. And if it is a lithophone, it should ring like you're tapping on a metal bell, a xylophone, or a wooden marimba. And if you play on the top, it usually plays one note. And if you play on the side, the lateral edges, it'll play a different note. Next. So we've learned a lot about these groundstone artifacts, but really a lot more work is necessary. We have a lot more questions still. How were they played by hunter-gatherers versus sedentary people who lived in pueblos, for example? What are the dates of use? How far back do they go in Colorado and all of North America? Was their use related to ritual or ceremony, or maybe there were other purposes? How and where were they made and played? What are the source areas for the rock that was used? And what's the geographical extent of their use? And what can these sounds produced by the lithophones tell us about the cultures of people who made them? This is really an interesting question to me. I probably won't live long enough to answer that, but I think it's something we should ask about. Because the study of lithophones involves one of our senses, in other words, hearing and sound, that we don't really normally think about when analyzing artifacts, it allows us to think about how and where ancient peoples experience sounds. This is a fairly new concept for archaeologists who definitely aren't necessarily used to thinking about archaeology and artifacts in that particular way. One of our big questions is how and where were these lithophones played in the past? Were they usually only played individually by, say, one person? Or did people bring their lithophones together, say? That's what we're wondering at Great Sand Dunes. Were they coming together to meet at a certain place and people brought their lithophones, or did they cache them there and then they all played their lithophones? And I always ask, were they having a rock concert, or a hard rock concert together? And were there groups of lithophones actually made specifically to be played together in prehistoric times? Well, I think if you look at this copy of a newspaper that's on this slide, it's dated 1953, but it discusses a find of 23 kiva bells, which are basically lithophones that are unmodified stone that were found together as a set at a pueblo site in New Mexico. And not only would this be interesting to think about that somebody actually created this set of lithophones, probably to be played together, but the musical notes that they created will help us understand the musical notes and scales that were chosen by these people, and maybe even give us some ideas about cultural traditions, and even give us clues to the geographic origins of the people who played them. So now, what I really like to do is figure out where these kiva bells might be curated, because I'd love to perhaps go there to that museum and see if they would allow me to study these lithophones and listen to the sound and try to understand some of these things that we're questioning. Next. So we have a lot of questions. We have a few answers, but that's okay, because I think that's how science should work. But studying these lithophones has really helped me have more of a connection to people who lived in the past, because music is really an expression, I think, of all humanity. It's really considered the universal language even today. And I think it's also a universal language from the present to the past. So I think it's important, music is important today in all cultures. And so it really shouldn't be a surprise that music was important to people thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago as well. And like I said in the little intro video, you know, it's important to think about people were spending time to make these. So they weren't just killing animals and processing food, they were creating these lithophones. And now I think we have a chance to learn more about these artifacts by examining museum collections, and hopefully some of you will come up with some of these. And finally, I'd just like to thank Todd for asking me to give this presentation. And you can see all of the folks here who I'd like to thank. It took a lot of different people to support this work. So thank you. And if you have any questions, I don't know, Todd can help us answer them.
Yes, thank you very much, Marilyn, for this wonderful presentation. I know that some people might need to go, so if you do, that's fine. If you want to stick around for a couple of questions or a few questions, we can do that. I'm also going to send out the link to the handouts here. So hold on just a second, and I'll get that for everybody. And I'll also send it out as a follow-up as well. So if anybody would like to unmute and ask directly a question, that would be great.
Or if you have answers, that'd be great too. And if anybody needs help, if you're trying to identify lithophones and you have any questions, or if I can possibly help you do anything with the lithophones, just let me know. And if I'm near where you are, I'd be happy to come and help you out with that. So it looks like there aren't any real specific questions. I appreciate all the comments. Todd, do you have anything else you'd like to mention?
No, here's the link, if anybody's still on, and I'll send that out again as a follow-up, so everybody who's here and who registered.
Great, well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure looking forward to hearing whether anybody comes up with any of these lithophones in their collections. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Marilyn.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep. We'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds great.
Thank you.